Barbara, I'm sorry, I think we can't hear you. Yes.
Now you can.
Yes, now we can. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. Hello, everybody, and welcome to When Two Tongues Touch Literature and Language Across Cultures, the seventh webinar of this year's edition of 9 Months, 9 Universities, the series of online lectures organized within the framework of Working Group 11 of the Arcus European University Alliance. My name is Barbara Grödecke. I'm involved in the activities of Working Group 11 here at the University of Padua, and I'm also one of the experts on autonomous language learning at the university's Language Center. The Arcus Alliance brings together 9 universities who share academic, scientific, and cultural objectives, a common vision of the role of higher education and research, and mutual fields of interest. Together, the partner universities are building an innovative and inclusive approach to education, to research, and to innovation. Working Group 11 is the plurilingual and intercultural hub of the Alliance and aims to promote plurilingualism to foster intercultural competences amongst the Alliance's universities. The webinars of the series 9 Months, 9 Universities are intended to generate awareness and appreciation for the topic of multilingualism and interculturalism and an understanding of the many areas of our lives that are related to and influenced by language. The webinars focus on specific topics related to language and culture and target mainly graduate and postgraduate students, as well as early stage researchers and all the staff interested in those topics. Let me now introduce you to today's speakers from the University of Graz, Christine Schwanecke and Lisa Schantl. Christine Schwanecke is a professor of English literature and culture, currently serving as the head of the Center for Cultural Studies at the University of Graz. Her academic journey includes significant roles at the University of Heidelberg, the International PhD Program for Literary and Cultural Studies in Gießen, and professorships at Mannheim University and Gießen University. Christine's career is marked by international engagement, including a visiting scholarship at the University of Oxford and her involvement in the European PhD program, Literary and Cultural Studies. Her work emphasizes the internationalization and interdisciplinary development of emerging researchers. Recognized for her interdisciplinary and transsectoral approach to research and teaching, Professor Schwanecke has received accolades such as the Ruprecht-Karls-Prize from the Foundation Universität Heidelberg for a dissertation on the intersection of literature and photography. Her collaborative efforts extend to prestigious cultural institutions, including festivals such as the Ruhr-Triennale and the Steirischer Herbst. Professor Schwanecke's scholarly contributions are extensive, comprising 2 monographs, 5 co-edited interdisciplinary essay collections, and over 40 articles in various academic publications. Her research spans diverse genres, with a particular focus on the interplay between literature and culture, especially in early, modern, and post-digital contexts. Lisa Schantl is a PhD candidate in the field of English Literary and Cultural Studies at the University of Graz and Vilnius University within the framework of the Arcus Alliance. Her research in English Literary and Cultural Studies focuses on literary multilingualism in the Anglosphere, with a particular emphasis on translingual poetry. Lisa is the founder and editor-in-chief of the literary magazine Tin Journal and co-head of Blättern, a literary space for emerging writers in Graz. And she's also a freelance translator for German and English. Lisa studied English and American Studies as well as philosophy at the University of Graz and Montclair State University, New Jersey. In 2023, she co-edited the anthology Tinted Trials, exploring writings in English as a second language. Her contributions to both academia and culture have been recognized through various scholarships and grants. The topic of today's webinar is the role of literature in fostering intercultural understanding in the globalized world. The presentation explores how poets writing in English as a second language offer unique insights into the transculturalism, challenging recent trends that limit access to cultural diversity and create works that showcase the benefits of crossing borders. Linguistic innovations in second language poetry serve as points of connection and disconnection, build transcultural knowledge, and promote intercultural understanding. The focus on this underexplored art form offers an opportunity to highlight the power of translingual poetry to counteract nationalist tendencies and to celebrate the rich diversity of our global era, transcending linguistic and cultural boundaries. Before I hand over the screen to Professor Christine Schwanecke and to Lisa Schantl, I would like to remind you to leave your comments and questions in the comment box, and I will pass them over to the speakers at the end of their talk. Well, Christine and Lisa, danke, dass ihr heute bei uns seid. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise today. And the screen is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Barbara, for your kind introduction. Thank you also to the Arcus team for inviting us. Lisa and I are very happy to be here and to meet you, colleagues from all across Europe here in that virtual space. So thanks for joining us and for your interest in our topic, When Two Tongues Touch, Literature and Language Across Cultures. Very similar to the basic idea of this format, our webinar is thematically going to be about transnational connectivity, about cultural meeting points, and about the creative potential of plurality and difference. And as our verbal image of two tongues that touch suggests, this talk is about the touching and meeting of languages and cultures. It's about how many things become one, a new fascinating thing, just like the head on our PowerPoint presentation. And this talk is also to illustrate the power of poetry when it comes to overcoming national boundaries and social fissures. So I'd like to start. By way of an introduction, we'd like to highlight that the 21st century, our century, is without question an era of intensified exchange between cultures and social groups. At the same time, recent political and corporate developments aim at limiting the general public's access to the diversity and plurality that this era has to offer. In times of an increased valorization of nationalism, literature represents an invaluable counterpoint in that it effectively showcases the benefits of geographical and intellectual border crossings, via both its content and its rhetoric. Translingual writers who compose literary works also in their second, third, fourth, fifth languages provide us with an especially immediate point of access to the idea of transculturalism. With a heightened sense for the liminal zones between geographies, languages, cultures, the works of such translingual authors cater to our understanding of transcultural experiences and nuances. So this talk will provide an introduction to an under-examined art form under that scope, translingual and transcultural poetry in English. And you'll have to note that English is the poet's second or third or fourth language. That is, their idiolect, their personal language, is transfused with knowledge of other primary languages and cultures. After the present introduction, Lisa will look at poetry from a translingual point of view. And afterwards, I will look at poetry from a transcultural perspective. Both perspectives are complementary, and the one couldn't go without the other. We'll end our talk with a brief conclusion, and after this, there will be the Q&A. But first things first, let's begin. Lisa is going to look at poetry from a translingual perspective. Now, that is, she focuses on aspects of language, and I'm going to hand over to her now.
So thank you, Christine, for the wonderful introduction. Also, thanks from my side to the Arcus Alliance for having us today. And yes, I have the honor to conduct the first part of this talk today. And my aim is to give you a well-structured first introduction to the manifold appearances of Anglophone translingual poetry, with a particular focus on the linguistic aspect of this form of writing. I will do so by discussing the work of the poet Armand Davoudian, whose book you see on the slide. So let me give you briefly some background information on this poet. Davoudian grew up in Iran with Armenian as his household's primary language and an education in Persian from primary school onward. At the age of 17, he entered the US, and soon thereafter, English became his primary language, and also the language he composes his poetry in. And on the example of 3 poems from his debut collection, The Palace of 40 Pillars, which was published in 2024, we will now have a close look at the poeticization of multiple languages and how these translingual moves shape our understanding of the English language as a literary code. So our roadmap for the analysis will be a main publication in the field of multilingual literary studies, Till Dembeck and Rolf Parr's Handbook on Literary Multilingualism, a 2020 publication. And in this book, Dembeck and Parr describe rather overarching themes in multilingual literary studies, which they refer to as basic procedures of literary multilingualism. These are code switching and language mixing, multilingualism in literary dialogues, multiscriptism, and heterolingual quotations. Please don't worry if these terms do not mean much to you yet. We will spend our time together now to figure out their meanings, their functions, and their appearances in actual literary text. So I suggest we get right to it. First, we'll look at code switching and language mixing and multilingualism in literary dialogues. Code switching has its roots in the study of language contact and commonly is defined as, quote, the alternation of languages within a conversation, end of quote, and this is Matrosh. This definition is very broad and it leaves a lot of room for fine-tuning. So further distinctions have been made, such as alternational code switching, so that languages differ on the level of utterances or sentences, and insertional code switching, where individual other lingual words or short phrases are inserted into a matrix language. And this terminology is by Muishkin. So as you see on the slide here, the alternational code switch is rather a separate batch of separate chocolates, right? Like you have individual chunks of languages, but they really appear separate and you can clearly identify them. Whereas with insertional code switching, the matter already gets a little bit more complicated. So we have one large matrix language. So here the dark chocolate kind of represents that. And then we have tiny bits of other languages that infuse this matrix language. So the white chocolate mixes into the dark chocolate, and I am craving chocolate now. I don't know what about you, but I hope the image kind of illustrates my point here. So this still is linguistics though, right? If we look at literary works, the borders between languages can become even more blurry, and the extents and natures of the switches, they can become really difficult to demarcate. So for example, only individual components of words, so-called morphemes, can be influenced by another language. Or the entire form of a poem can be inspired by a literary tradition based in another language. Or authors might play with homophones, so same sounding words, and homographs, same spelled words. To illustrate the many dimensions of literary code switching, Johanna Domokos has first drafted and then refined the table together with Mariana Deganutti. And this table contains 7 degrees, mainly based on the extent and the intensity of the switches. And as handy as such a table is, we have to remember that in literature, and especially in poetry, the code switches are highly aestheticized, and layers of meaning may be added based on subtle nuances like spelling, grammar, or syntax choice. So literary code switching, and the authors of this framework are very much aware of this, most of all is a continuum. The example that we'll look at now to make this a little more graspable combines the practice of code switching with Denberg and Parr's second basic procedure, multilingualism in literary dialogues. In the second stanza of the poem that we'll look at, a short dialogue is presented in German, while most of the poem is composed in English. So this is Armand Davoudian's poem, Something There Is That Doesn't Love. And I've pasted here the beginning of the poem and then the second stanza on the presentation, but there's two more stanzas of the entire work if you're interested. I'll just briefly read through it. It starts, We're in Deutsche Camp. But mostly we play soccer, shirtless against the shirts, and afterward we screw as 20-somethings too. We even fall in love, whispering in the dark of the campus graveyard under the sacred oath of German 101. Ich liebe dich, mein Liebling, und ich dich liebe auch. Here, highlighted in yellow, we can witness the coming together of two languages in one literary text. I think that's already pretty cool. But the fun really begins when we zoom in on the exact representation of this alternational code switch. The first utterance adheres to standard German. It says, Ich liebe dich, mein Liebling. The second phrase, however, includes a grammatical error. Und ich dich liebe auch, versus the correct version would actually be, und ich liebe dich auch. Now you may think, all right, so there's an error, and now what? Okay. The poem's subject matter is clearly given as that of language learning, right? So we have these explicit references to Deutsche Camp, German 101. I think we can agree on that. The code switch now allows us to experience the subject matter through a multilingual aestheticization of dialogue in the language that is being learned. We witness the so-called reality effect. Here I'm quoting Julia Radaelli, which she took from Roland Barthes. So this means that a speech situation is evoked in a literary text as it would be in the actual world. In our example, this mimetic function, which has also been described by Deganutti and Domokos, highlights how multilingualism in literary dialogues can represent various speaking modes. It can be used to evoke standard varieties, regional varieties such as dialects, particular accents, individual idiosyncrasies, or various degrees of language proficiency. In the case of the poem Attend, a grammatical error is displayed and language is revealed as a tool which can be flawed, which has to be learned, and which might appear in various variants on a language learner's journey. All right, so this was an example of a manifest form of literary code switching. But there's a further variant, which is commonly known as latent multilingualism. And this means the hidden use of another language in a literary text. The image that you see on the slide here is kind of how latent multilingualism works. So we have all this beautiful scenery. We could imagine kind of a storyline in here. And somewhere in between, though, there is another language or even many other languages hiding. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the image, but in the image, there's a bird hiding. No, I'm not going to point it out to you. I'll leave this up for you to come back to the video if you haven't spotted it yet and figure it out, just like the task of latent multilingualism, basically. So let's get back to literature. An example of this particular case has inspired our title of the talk actually today, the 16th sonnet of the sonnet cycle that is included in Davoudian's debut collection. It starts with, reading a parallel text tragedy, Persian and English on opposite sides, like lovers whom an ancient grudge divides. Based on this information, we know that another language is at work in this poem. However, we do not experience it immediately. Deganutti and Domokos refer to this type of literary multilingualism as overt zero-degree code switching, because overt indicates that there is a reference made to another language. And what I find very interesting in this poem is that figuratively, the poet invites us to imagine very literally the collision of the two languages. Davoudian closes this poem with the line, when I close the book, two tongues touch. This described physical touch of two languages, depicted by the physical touch of the book's pages, can be understood as an effective metaphor for the coming together of two separate languages that form one new, idiosyncratic interlanguage. Here I'm quoting Rainier Grutmann. So thus a new form of language is being created, a new literary code that has become the poem's as well as the poet's soil. All right. So next, I suggest we look at the other two remaining basic procedures of literary multilingualism, which are heterolingual quotations and multiscriptism. And we will do so with a joint example. What you see here is the pretext to the 20-part centerpiece of the Woodean's debut collection, the sonnet cycle. And I will not fall into the trap of pronunciating Persian, so I hope you're satisfied by the English enunciation, which is Isfahan is half the world. This body of text appears in the form of a Persian proverb in Persian. So that's our heterolingual quotation in another language than English. And it is presented in Arabic script, the mode in which Persian is spelled in Iran and Afghanistan. That's multiscriptism. And it is directly followed by a translation into English. Based on suggested functions by Denberg and Parr, we can say that the proverb is a connecting element. That is, it brings together the Persian literary tradition in contact with the Anglophone. It connects the Arabic and the Latin script, and it relates the Shakespearean sonnet as a poetic form to the city of Isfahan as a socio-political form. We will come to that shortly. And further, though, it contains a reference to the grandeur of the Iranian city of Isfahan. So in that it says, Isfahan is half the world. And this is crucial to our understanding that this city was very meaningful in earlier times, and actually it still is a major city of Western Iran. So consequentially, it creates the impression that whatever follows responds to or continues this grand story. So the pretext is quite important to our understanding of the following sonnets. In all of this, though, the Persian culture is not merely referenced as a side note. It is actually emphasized and brought center stage by means of the introduction of a foreign script, a so-called foreign object effect, and here I'm quoting Monika Schmitz-Ehmans, is created, which confronts the reader with the limits of their literacy competences, and it creates a puzzle within the text. The caused irritation can, as Schmitz-Ehmans says, amongst other things, raise attention or create an aesthetical effect. In our case, the aesthetical effect is indeed one with severe implications. If we look at the sonnet cycle's form, the cycle mimics the most prevalent architectural trait of the actual palace that is referenced in the cycle's title, the Palace of the 40 Pillars. This palace is also known as Chehel's tomb, and it is an actual structure in Isfahan, which was erected by Shah Abbas II in the 17th century. And the palace's 20 pillars are reflected in a pool, to the effect that actual structure plus this reflection create the impression of 40 pillars. I've also added a little map on the slide here to show you where Isfahan, also sometimes spelled with an E, is actually located in Iran, if you're interested. So, Davoudian applies this aesthetical feature with the actual representation and the mirror to his poems. Almost each of the 20 sonnets is, as he explains in an interview with Literary Hub, quote, asymmetrically divided in the middle, like the pillars of the palace, half real and half imagined. If we consider this division into first a representation of reality and second an imaginary element connected to the realistic representation, we can further reason that this duality of real versus imagined can be found in the pretext already. The original representation, so the first part, is the one in Arabic script, and the translation, the second part, is the mirrored version. The translation is framed as a mere imagist idea of the original. Even more so, if we understand the implied reader as an English-only speaker, the words presented in English might as well be entirely unrelated to what the Arabic script contains. As a consequence, Davoudian's translingual stylistic choice accurately illustrates, First, the limits of translation, as it shows it as a reflection, as a mirrored, watered, blurred image of the original. And second, it illustrates the uncanny relationship between the original and the translation, because this bond ultimately remains an issue of trust for the target language only reader. With this, I have come to the end of my part of today's talk. So our journey through the basic procedures of literary multilingualism, as described by Dembeck and Parr, allowed us to unpack a variety of modes, as well as themes in translingual poet Armand Davoudian's work. We saw how languages can collide and create additional dimensions of meaning, and we explored how questions challenging the truthfulness of translation or translatability as such can become apparent in second language writing. And now it is my honor to pass on and give the stage to Christina to continue with the transcultural aspects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Now with me, we'll change perspectives and I will focus on cultural aspects now. So a bit different from translinguistic is what is termed transculture, also another fancy term. What does it mean? It means things, people and perspectives that involve, encompass or spread across two or more cultures. You've perhaps heard it before, but you've probably more often heard intercultural. While intercultural refers to matters that, in line with the Latin origins of the term inter, denote things that exist between two or more cultures or involve two or more cultures, transcultural perspectives spread across separate concerns. They're less concerned with the negotiation processes and practices between diverse cultures. They rather focus on the transcending quality of the results of these intercultural processes and practices. Transcultural perspectives regard culture per se not as a self-contained unit, but as an inherently relational entity. So no culture evolves without the exchange with other cultures. To acknowledge this means to study any given culture from a transcultural perspective. On the basis of Maria Amor Barros del Rio's observations on Irish culture, one can argue that all cultures are, to some extent, transcultural. They continually evolve with others and in relation to others through migration, cultural transfers, or through internal and external, and I quote, ideas and beliefs, foreign practices, and unexpected exchanges, end of quote. Thus, cultures keep constantly renewing themselves with others and in relation to others, and they persistently produce, I quote, new cultural expressions, unquote. And these new cultural expressions can and should be studied from a transcultural perspective. And this is what I'd like to exemplify today. Like Lisa, I will look at a certain cultural expression, and if not a novel, an unusual kind of poetry. But I won't do this from a linguistically informed perspective. I will take the complementary approach and set out to do this from a decidedly transcultural perspective. So today, I would like to look at what's called dub poetry. And I'd like to argue that one can define dub poetry as a transcultural practice. Because it's a poetry that uses knowledge of two or more different cultures and at the same time transcends their boundaries. Dub poetry crystallizes in what we could call a third space, a shared space in which elements from each culture merge and create something new. So that poetry is part of each culture, but at the same time stands apart, transcends any cultural boundaries. Before I come to a canonic example, I'd like to maybe list the genre's features first. So dub poetry originated in Jamaica in the 1970s, and it was inspired by the Rastafari movement. It was written to be performed and was often based on reggae beats. Often it's written in what's termed Jamaican Creole. Within this context, and with a poet we'll look at in a minute, we have to state that this poet's idiolect, that is his individual language, is informed and formed by at least 3 languages: Barbadian and Jamaican, his first languages, and English, his second. And all of these form his idiolect. So that poetry as such can be called translingual because it's infused by a variety of languages. What has to be also noted that it's a very political art form. It often deals with oppression and injustice, and it tries to work against it. But why can we call that poetry a transcultural poetry? As I said earlier, it can be regarded as a third space in which poets experiment with multiple forms of cultural expression. As Haberkost shows, there is a Jamaican scene in which Jamaican and a myriad of other cultures, for instance, African cultures, crystallize in dub poetry. There's a British scene in which Jamaican and British cultures shape this kind of transcultural poetry. There's a Canadian scene and other scenes. So that poetry is not just transcultural, it's also transnational. That poetry is a space in which high and popular culture merge. As the pioneer of dub poetry, Linton Kwesi Johnson observes, I quote, "The dub lyricist is the DJ turned poet. He intones his lyrics rather than sings them. Dub lyricism is a new form of oral music poetry, wherein the lyricist overdubs rhythmic phrases onto the rhythm background of a popular song," unquote. So as you can see from this example, not only DJ and poet become one, also oral and written traditions overlap in production and reception. So reading, speaking, singing, and performing coexist. And what concerns the signs used, sign systems merge, as music, one sign system, and literature, another one, are used to create dub poems. As a topical full-length study of dub poetry remarks, and I quote again Haberkost, dub poetry may be presented in the form of live performances, on record, or in the medium of the printed text. Dub poets may recite their works a cappella over the background sounds of music, to the accompaniment of a percussionist, or against the amplified sounds of a fully fledged band, unquote. So what concerns the spaces of production and reception, dub poetry is transsexual. As Haberkost continues, quotes, "Performances may take place in a classroom or in a prison, at demonstrations and on picket lines, at established literary readings, in a local pub, or on an international concert stage," unquote. So as you can see from there, dub poetry is not only performed in spaces that we conventionally associate with higher low culture, it's also a genre that spreads across them. And it spreads across politics, think demonstration, prison, across the arts, think classroom, and established literary reading. So I guess one can see that at least genre theoretically, dub poetry can be regarded as highly transcultural. But alas, as Mephisto so brilliantly puts it in Goethe's Faust, "Grey, dear friend, is all theory, and green the golden tree of life." So from theory to practice, I'd like to just show you dub poetry live, at least through a video, so you can get an impression of how it sounds and feels. Here's a brilliant dub poet. He's Benjamin Zephaniah. He was a British writer, dub poet, musician, and professor of poetry. And in his work, he drew on his experiences, his life experiences, bad ones like incarceration and racism, but also enriching ones like his Jamaican heritage. In the following video, he performs his poem This Poetry in Newcastle at Live Theatre Festival in March 2009. And now I'm going to show you what this poetry sounds like. Listen closely.
This poetry is like a rhythm that drops. The tongue brings a rhythm that shoots like a shot. This poetry is designed for ranting, dancehall style, big mouth chanting. This poetry won't put you to sleep saying, follow me like your blind sheep. This poetry is not party political, not designed for those who are critical. This poetry goes with me when I go to my bed. It gets into my dreadlocks and it lingers around my head. This poetry is with me when I am riding my bike. I have tried Shakespeare, respect you dear, but this is the stuff I like. This poetry is not afraid of going in a book. No, but this poetry needs ears to hear and eyes to have a look. Yes, this poetry is verbal rhythm, no big words involved, and if I have a problem, the rhythm gets installed. I have tried to be romantic. It did not good for me. I take a reggae rhythm and build my poetry. I could try something personal, but you've heard it all before. No written words are needed because plenty words in store. This poetry is called globalization. The tongue plays a beat and the body starts skanking. This poetry is quick and childish. This poetry is for the wise and foolish. Anybody can read for free. This poetry is for you and me. Don't stretch your imagination. This poetry is for the good of the nation. Chant in the morning, I chant in the night, I chant in the darkness and under the spotlight. I pass through university, I pass through sociology, and then I got a dread degree in dreadful ghettoology. This poetry is with me when I take a walk, and when I'm talking to myself in poetry, I talk. This poetry is with me, below me, and above. You see, this poetry is from inside me and goes to you with love. Happy birthday.
So yeah, this has power, as you've just seen and heard. And this art is highly poetic. It has verses, they rhyme, at least partially. The poem has a rhythm, it has imagery, but it's probably not what people think of first when they hear the word poetry. Because this poetry is not recited in well-behaved verses. It's performed, it's cheeky, it's fun, it has thrust. It's not what people expect based on their poetry experiences from school and university in all likelihood. And it's not Shakespeare. And it definitely does not want to be like Shakespeare. It's a poem that explores the liminal space between different literary and musical traditions, and thus expands to new territory. How so? I'll try to show this. Here you have the first stanza, in which the lyrical eye makes clear that they recognize, are part of, and respect the English literary tradition. And Shakespeare stands metonymically for it. As a part of the English tradition, Shakespeare's poetry represents the whole of it. And the lyrical eye says, I've tried Shakespeare, respect due there. But Shakespeare does not quite fit the speaker's purposes. That poetry does. This poetry does. It is the poetry that the speaker, quote, likes, here in the yellow highlight. To the speaker, poetry has to be designed in a way that makes it usable in everyday life. And that's what that poetry can do, or what can be done with that poetry. This poetry can be part of people's everyday lives because it's really low threshold. The speaker exemplifies, quote, this poetry is with me when I go to my bed. This poetry goes with me as I pedal my bike. So from cycling to walking to going to bed at night, that poetry can be with people, accompany them through their lives. Quote, this poetry is with me, below me and above. Being with people, below and above them, is almost spiritual. Poems are described like a safe space, which have the capacity to give people both safety and comfort, and which surrounds them throughout the day, every day. In addition, the speaker wants poetry to transcend rigid divides, such as generic and cultural ones. By thematizing divides and combining opposing categories like lyrical language, music, or socially dividing categories like high and low culture, the poem transcends these oppositions. As the lyrical speaker says, I quote, I take a reggae rhythm and build me poetry. So the speaker takes a stance for combining literature and music, reggae and poetry, as well as different cultural and traditions, reggae music and its rhythm, as well as experiences of Shakespeare. And these things are combined to make transcultural literature and experiences. The lyrical speaker also takes a stance for literature not to carry an all too heavy cultural baggage or cultural capital. Quote, this poetry is quick and childish. But that's meaning it's quick and playful. You don't need to go through long and difficult educational and maturing processes to understand it. And literary critics mark that poetry is, quote, not designed for those who are critical. So by intertextually referencing highbrow literary practices like literary criticism and negating poetry's educational odor by basing it on well-liked music, the speaker characterizes that poetry as one that is built on transcending generic categories, transcending categories of high and low cultures, as well as social divides. And being as it is, that poetry is to be part of Europe's culture, and it is ready to be canonized as such. As is stated in the beginning of the second stanza, even though this poetry is not dependent on the written word, I quote, this poetry is not afraid of going in a book. And I'm coming to my final and maybe yet the most important point. Transcultural poetry, this poetry is inclusive in its production and reception. In its production, it involves musical experience and the whole body. I quote, this poetry is verbal rhythm, no big words involved. And if I have a problem, the rhythm gets it solved, unquote. Unquote. You could call this poetry dub ranting. The tongue plays a beat, the body starts skanking. So music is involved in the production, rhythm and language, and the speaker's whole body. And in its reception, that poetry is inclusive too, because it is for everyone, independently of their cultural, educational, and economic backgrounds. Quote, this poetry is for the wise and foolish. Anybody can do it for free. This poetry is for you and me. Don't stretch your imagination. This poetry is for the good of the nation. And with this, the speaker makes clear there are different cultural backgrounds. But if societies are not afraid of cultural exchange, of opening up towards cross-cultural influence, and of including transcultural viewpoints, this can be only good for societies and nations. And this is really important message, especially in times of rising nationalisms and fissures within societies and between different social groups. Transcultural poetry seeks to build bridges, unite, advertise tolerance, and this regarding both culturally rich hybrid literary forms and cultural heterogeneous, equally rich cultures or nations. This poetry emphasizes what unites people and cultures, not what divides them. And this is shown also in the final verses, where a bridge is built between speaker and addressee, and where the lyrical I says, "This poetry is from inside me, and it goes to you with love." End of quote. And on that note, I'm going to hand back over for the final conclusion to Lisa.
Thank you, Christine, for providing this insights into transcultural poetry. So on this admittedly somewhat cheesy but hopeful ending, I have the honor to round up our talk. So by first looking at translingual writers like Armand Davoudian and examining the cross-language writing practices employed by them, we discussed the meeting points of languages, and they were shown as inter- and transsectoral spaces that create additional layers of meaning. The linguistic de- and transformations and innovations that we discussed in this presentation do not simply encourage a new understanding of the global Anglophone literary canon, but they moreover show us how the often as rigid perceived boundaries between languages can become fluid, blurry, and thus they show us how a new poetic code emerges from the grounds of multi- and translingual poetry. And in the second step, we focused on the transcultural dimension of poetry writing. Looking at dub poetry, in particular Benjamin Zefanaya's This Poetry, we hope that we have demonstrated how dub poetry can be conceptualized as a third space, which transcends cultures and medial binaries. And how poetry thus can serve as something that links cultures and people and highlights what they share rather than what separates them. So we hope that we have shown that translingual and transcultural poetry is not just a space where tongues touch, but also a space where people meet and eventually hearts touch and are touched. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks, Arcus, for having us. We had much fun, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine and Lisa. Thank you so much. And yes, you managed to show that not only tongues touch, but also people, hearts. I was thinking about yeah, it's not only tongues, but hearts. But then I thought maybe they think it's cheesy, but it's so true. Waiting if there are questions coming up, I might ask you a question. The first one is related to what you said in your conclusion, where you started the conclusion when you said that languages can become very, very blurry. And that's true, but I was wondering if you have an example for such an intense case, as you said, because I was very curious. Before I forget about it, I would rather.
Sure. Yes, there's plenty of them out there. They're sometimes hard to find, admittedly, because the publishing scene is still rather limited when it comes to high multiple layers of publication. But so if I could get my screen up again, I can actually briefly draw up an example and show it to you. So I don't know if this is possible. Can my screen be shared again? Yeah, okay, perfect. So this is what just came really to my mind real quick. That's a poem by Sabira Stolberg. And believe it or not, it involves 40 languages. So she is a true polyglot. Yeah, like I think like no other that I am aware of at this point in time. So it's 40 languages that mix in this poem. It already starts with quite a different idea of empire, emperies, imperium, empires. So she also plays very artistically with language. And while she's doing that on an innovative level, she also uses the actual languages that blur together. And the nice thing is that when you Google Balala of Imperia and Stallberry, you'll find this work and also a little description actually of the text, what's in there. So you see there's Arabic, there's Bashkir, Belarusian, yeah, we have some English, Latin, Latvian, Mongolian, you really can name it. So this poem combines a whole world, not just an empire. And you can also listen to it on YouTube. So I really suggest that you look at it and tune in to get a feeling of, yeah, how the languages blur and become things like this. So yeah, I hope this is something that illustrates how intense the switches can become, so that there are actually no switches anymore, but rather just blurs of a wonderful new dialect. Yeah.
Wow. I thought something like 4 or 5 languages would already be many. But, that's really amazing. Wow. Well, I will just take the time as nobody else is asking questions right now. So I was thinking when I read you the abstract, and I was kind of thinking about what this talk would be about. I was thinking that poetry, actually, yes, is a very high form of culture and literature, I would say, but it's also very niche, because not many people, and I don't know nowadays, I mean, with the younger people, but I was thinking, isn't it a bit a niche type of literature to research on? And what about the things that are more, yeah, you see more around, or you see more interest in by young people nowadays? Even though then when I listened to this poetry and when I saw the video of this poetry, I thought, okay, kind of, it merges also with, I can imagine that this type of poetry merges also with other forms of culture, or even subculture. I mean, even if that sounds not nice. What about other forms of literature, like or of art, like TV series or whatever art? Well, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Lisa, shall I? Yeah, one might think that poetry is niche because that's it's if you teach at a university, the classes are probably not that full. But then when you go on the internet, I think poetry is more closer to people's heart than one thinks. For instance, if you think of YouTube videos like that, or of fringe festivals like the Edinburgh Festival, where there are performances of poetry that makes this genre, or that brings the genre closer to people's heart, you can see that this is something that is consumed on a daily basis, maybe as much as TV series. Or if you think of Insta poetry, where people can both produce or receive poetry. And then what one often forgets, and what's already indicated in that poetry, is that poems today come in the form also of pop songs. I'm currently teaching a seminar on Shakespeare and Taylor Swift. It's surprising how much poetry there is in very good pop songs. There are intertextual references. There are brilliant new words, neologisms. So actually, to quote a pop song and modify it, not love is all around, but poetry is all around us in such very low threshold things like pop songs. And there are sometimes very good ones.
Yeah, and then exactly. I didn't want to be or to sound snobbish when I said.
No, but you're right, because that's what everybody thinks. That's why usually poetry classes, people don't register for those. I've taught classes where there were only 7 people, but then they realized, wow, that's cool, especially when it's performed, or wow, I can do this myself. I can write haikus myself, and they can express how I feel. They really start to like it, and they really see that it's all around somehow. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
And we have some upcoming questions also. So from the audience, the first question is, what is the exact difference between code switching and mixing?
Yeah, I think I'll take this question. Yeah, perfect. So generally, there's kind of 2 understandings of different scholars. So code switching, though, they kind of agree on, is as long as we can identify the languages that are switched, right? So as long as I can tell, even if I only have one word and it contains already 2 languages, if one part is in English and the other part is, for example, in German or in any other language, this is still a code switch. I can identify the switch of the languages. With mixing, this is terminology. So language mixing is terminology from Dembeck and Pa, rather. And they understand it as either an entire blur of the languages, or as also the latent multilingualism example that I showed earlier. So that when you still have a different language somewhere hiding below the text, but you don't really see it. So actually code switching is for them kind of in between, and then language mixing either as taking a form of something or referencing a language, and on the other hand, making the languages unrecognizable. And the other scholarly part says, so Mariana Deganuti and Johanna Domokos are referenced here, that everything kind of could be understood as a code switch. Because also with language mixing, we can still find out, if we look close enough, if we also take the author biographies into account, which languages actually inform a text. So we can decipher the languages anyhow. And that's how they came up with the 7 degrees, which also includes 0-degree code switching, which basically means language mixing, right? So that's the main difference. I hope I kind of demonstrated this clear. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Muhammad, for this question. And another question, there's a question for you, Lisa, from Pascal. Because of the reflective nature of translations, should literary translations always be assessed in how they reflect or not reflect their original forms?
Huge question. Thank you, Pascal. That is a huge question. And I think translation studies has been dealing with this for a very long time. Because, right, we always have to think of also the target culture, right? So where do I stay true to the original? Where do I diverge? And where do I connect to my target culture? So I think this also comes back to transcultural practices, because we basically meet in these meeting points, in these fluid dimensions of languages and of cultures if we do translations. It's a very broad theme, and as I just can tell, because I'm not a translation studies scholar, right? So I just can tell from my translator practice. So what's the habit there is, it's really up to the publisher and to the translator, kind of, what they decide to do, if they rather want to stick to the original or if they want to really map something to the target language. So yeah, I think the original, where it still is in there, it's a broad question, and it might remain always up for debate. I might even say that. Yeah.
Okay. And then another question, a very precise question. What does the this in this poetry stand for? And how about that poetry? Can you explain the difference in a sentence and the similarity in another sentence?
Thank you very much for these questions. For these questions, Haley. So the this in this poetry stands for this, and there you can see how also on a phonological level there is the infiltration of another language into the English language, or maybe this is also what you could term the Creole element, where this is this. And as the creativity with language and the infiltration of other languages in DAP poetry is such a big factor, DAP poetry in general showcases deviations from standard English everywhere. So on a phonological level, on a syntactical level, on a morphological level. So that poetry, and now you are asking, that's the third and final question, what is the difference between this poetry and that poetry? This poetry is a concrete example with which I was introducing DAP poetry to you. There are, of course, a whole lot of other poems. I thought this poetry as an example was particularly interesting as it thematizes poetry itself and DAP poetry itself. So it's a poetological poem, a poem about poetry, about DAP poetry, and this is why I chose this one as an example. So it's not so much about differences and similarities. This poetry, the poem, is an example of DAP poetry, a big genre. Thanks, Haley, for this question.
Okay, so as far as I can see, there are no more upcoming questions from the audience, but I've got a very last one, and I was wondering if translingual literature has become more prominent in recent years, or is that just that the attention has at least a little grown on it? Like, yeah, is it a more recent phenomenon, or wasn't there enough attention before?
Lisa, do you wanna?
Sure, sure. Thank you. So it's actually not a recent phenomenon. Actually, the first poet has been a second language poet, Eduana, of Sumerians. So it really goes very, very, very far back. But it's just not received that much attention. I think because multilingualism, also if we look at it, multilingualism has been the norm for centuries. We're not aware of it. And in our really nationalistic gazes now, we just see the borders. We see language borders, country borders, and we often ignore the fact that language borders, do they even exist? So it's, it's just been not looked at, I think, from our contemporary scholarly perspective that much. It's been around, it's just not been that looked at. And also in our contemporary publishing scene, because of this monolingual paradigm, as it's often called, we kind of dwell in our national language realms. And so French literature is out there, English literature is out there, and we assume that English readers only are capable of reading only English text, right? So if there's another language mixed in, they might be shocked, they might not like it that much. So though as migration has really increased over the past centuries, it has, I think, doubled since the 1990s. So it's really gone up. And also with the internet, we witness that language exchanges, they just happen really fast. We learn languages way faster than we used to. Like, we can learn them way faster than we used to. So all of this, I think, has contributed to a more increased interest in multilingual literature, and also from the publishing side, a more interest in publishing the diverse literature, because also the audience has grown more diverse. And just to give a final example, so if you look at the Nobel laureates of literature, in the last 10 years, there was actually 2 second language speakers of English in there. So Kazuo Ishiguro and Abdul Razak Gurna. And this is definitely an increase, I'd say, in popularity. Yeah, so I think both publishing side and scholarly interest just are going up. Yeah.
Okay. There has been another question coming up from Pascal, and this one is for Christine. Are there older and more established examples of transcultural literary genres like Zap poetry?
Thank you very much, Pascal. As Lisa was just pointing out, literature or artists who write have always been traveling and interested in other cultures and cultural exchange. I don't know when it starts, but as Lisa said, I imagine that literary genres also always used to be transcultural to a certain extent. But as has been remarked by critics in the last decades, transcultural perspectives have really expanded. People are more interested in that. So it might be interesting, Pascal, if you are interested, I'd be certainly interested in that. Of going back to historic literature, going back diachronically in history and check to what extent there are transcultural or translinguistic experiments in literary genres, older literary genres, and check with this new perspective what we can gain from looking at those older texts with a transcultural perspective. I hope this answered the question a little.
I would say so. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I just had, I don't know, weirdly came up to my mind one of the monks in Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, who is one of the examples of obviously an invented figure in literature who is translanguaging a lot. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. And yeah, I think I will keep my eyes and ears open from now on to find other examples, because I was really impressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Again, also for moderating and being there, to all of the people who listened in to us, and once again to the Arcus team and to Lisa. It was fun to do this with you. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you also from my side. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.